Okay, welcome back. This is primary learning objectives 5 and 6 from your chapter 30, the war to end all wars. Actually, I want to start talking about number 5. This is describe America's economic and military role in the war. And this actually begins on page 704 of your chapter 30. And I really want to touch a couple of things here before we begin. Uh, Not only were we producing all this armament and all these bombs and guns and planes and ships to actually send to our allies in Europe before we entered the war. Now, of course, like I said in the last PLO, we're producing goods not only for them but also for ourselves. So production has to literally double. The other thing that we were doing was we were feeding the Allies. We were feeding France and Germany. I mean France and England rather. And not only do we have to feed them and keep them fed, basically because a war was the war had torn apart the entire continent. We also had to feed ourselves. So basically, what happens was. There were a couple of agencies started by the government. The first one, it's called the Food Administration, and this was headed by a gentleman named Herbert Hoover, of whom we're going to talk more later on. But basically, what this was an effort to actually save food and sort of not waste food and sort of make some sacrifices. Basically, what Hoover wanted to do was put some limits on the consumption of several items, but basically it was going to be done only on a voluntary basis. There was no, like in World War II, and World War II was a little different, but there was not going to be any ration cards or anything like that. It was going to be, if you want to do it, fine, we'll welcome you. If you don't want to do it, then you're not obligated. But basically what he did was make a list of things that actually needed to be saved in order to send overseas and to try to actually not waste. But basically, any type of meat, corn, breads, a lot of fruits were actually put on this list. And people actually took the initiative to start what was known then as victory gardens. And actually, this was neighborhood people that would get together and start their own gardens in order to grow tomatoes and to vegetables and things like that that were actually donated in order to be sent overseas, and they wouldn't have a demand for the tomatoes and the other vegetables that were being produced in farms to be sent overseas. The other thing that actually Hoover basically inspired the field administration. Actually, there was also the food administration, and the fuel administration actually basically began asking people to have heatless Mondays or lightless nights, gasless Sundays, in order to save fuel. And again, this was orchestrated by the government in order to get the people behind the effort of the war. That's part of the economic, again, mobilization that America had to start getting gear into for World War One. But however, I want to touch on a couple of things here really quick. The other things is the military role that America is going to take, starting on page 705. This is very important because, again, we might have been prepared a little bit in terms of the factories. What we were not prepared with very well was actually our military. Our military was depleted. There were really not that many soldiers to go around, so we needed to institute a draft and several things like that. Conscription, rather, or the draft, it says on page 705, was the only answer to the need for raising an immense army and at all possible speed. Unlike a draft in a civil war in which you could actually send a substitute, this was not an option anymore. If you were drafted, you were drafted, and you had to show up, or otherwise you would go to prison. Again, the war was not very popular in terms of being, the draft. On page 706 is here, the Draft Act to require registration of all males between the ages of 18 and 45. No draft dodger could purchase his exemption or hire a substitute as in the days of the Civil War. The only exceptions of the draft were people who were needed in key industries such as shipbuilding and steel manufacturing. Um, was it successful? The draft was successful. The mobilization of the American Army and the American military was rather fast. They didn't get a training that was, I guess, comparable to our allies. They did get the best training that they could, and they were sent overseas and shipped overseas. Again, remember that getting overseas to Europe was a risk. The submarines were still around the North Atlantic, so again, we're sending all these ships full of soldiers, and we're running the risk of losing them. Fortunately, there were not as many losses to submarines of cargo ships, transport ships rather. There was also effort to get the African Americans, which were serving on segregated units, into the fray. It says on page 706, African Americans also served in the armed forces, though in strictly segregated units and usually under white officers. Reflecting the racial attitudes of the time, military authorities hesitated to train black men for combat, and the majority of the black soldiers were assigned to construction battalions or put to work unloading ships. So again, that was the effort there, very unfairly with segregation at the time for African Americans. So basically, that is the majority of the role, the economic and military role that we played in the war. Again, you have to think of two things. Economically, we have to provide for ourselves, but we also have to provide for our allies. And in terms of the military, we did have the armaments. What we didn't have was men to fight the war. And again, the draft was a quick fix for that. And you can read all about that on page 705 and 706. Excuse me. Number 6, analyze Wilson's attempt to forge a peace based on the 14 points and explain why developments at home and abroad forced him to compromise. Basically, what you need to remember about the 14 points were just the ones that were mentioned in the classroom, in the lecture that we had. I think there was about 5 or 6 of them. The most important one really here being the League of Nations, and we're going to talk about that later on. His peace effort at home was really flawed because, again, of his idealism, his lack of realistic goals, his unwillingness to compromise with the Republican side of Congress. So those are the things that you need to remember here. His attempt to forge a peace really really failed under his unwillingness to compromise with the Republicans as to the 14 points. These were non-negotiable. He wanted them this way, and especially the one that really did him in was the capstone of the 14 points, which was the League of Nations, and we'll talk more about that later on. Okay, thank you very much.